Okay, and we'll start the slideshow from the current slide. Okay, actually that's the wrong slide, I'm sorry. All right. Okay. There's the right slide. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, the wonders of technology. Okay, so we're still talking about Buddhism in the era between 400 and 1500 of the Common Era. And the book is talking at this point about the expansion of Buddhism out of South Asia and into the rest of Asia as well. In South Asia itself, as the book mentions, there are some developments in in Hinduism that lead to the decline of Buddhism. And this is the beginning of devotional Hinduism. You may remember in the last chapter, around this period of time, we were talking and seeing the beginnings of the Puranas. And as we mentioned, the Puranas are specifically focused on one of the deities. And the Puranas talk about the various devotees, those who worship that particular deity, and how their lives are changed, how many miracles happen to them. And this rise in devotion, this rise in the notion that everybody can be devoted increasingly intensely to a particular god or goddess, and then that can lead to changes in their lives, that in some ways decreased the attractiveness of Buddhism. Also, at the same time in South Asia, we're getting an expansion of Islam as well. So, between the two factors there, Buddhism in South Asia declines to a great extent. There remains in Sri Lanka, which is an island at the southern tip of South Asia, there remains in Sri Lanka a fairly strong presence of Theravada Buddhism. And we've talked a little bit about Theravada Buddhism before and how it differs from Mahayana Buddhism as well. And again, if you do ever have some questions or comments, feel free either to raise your hand or to put them in chat. Okay, in China, as we'll see in the next chapter, China has a very complex history of religions within it. The two native religions in China are Taoism and Confucianism, and we'll talk more about those, of course, in the next chapter. At this period of time, Buddhism is expanding into China. Monasteries are being founded within China. But the history of China and the various religions within it changes. At some points in Chinese history, the three traditions of of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism are well tolerated, and all of them are tolerated within China. However, there are also periods of time where Buddhism is persecuted in China. And still, though, the Mahayana schools of Chan Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism thrive. And we'll talk more about the reasons for the persecutions of Buddhists when we get to the next chapter, which talks about East Asian religions. Also during this period of time, the future Buddha, Maitreya or Milo Pho, comes into prominence and into popularity. Now, as we probably have mentioned, the historic Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is not the only Buddha. There have been Buddhas before him and Buddhas after him. And the future Buddha, Maitreya, is seen as sort of a savior figure again who will come toward the end of time and restore things. And devotion to the future Buddha increases in China during this period. Okay, in Southeast Asia, there is also a strong Buddhist presence. And in Southeast Asia, Theravada Buddhism is the majority understanding. And this is in contrast to other places in Asia. In Japan, Again, something like China, the major schools that survive in Japan are Pure Land Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. And the two of them together form the majority of Buddhists within Japan. The native religion of Japan is Shinto, and again, we'll talk about that as well in the next chapter. And again, as in China, sometimes the traditions of Shinto and Confucianism from China and Buddhism, the three of them in Japan, sometimes are well tolerated with each other and have a good intermingling with each other, but in other times and places, one or other of the religions takes prominence, and there is a corresponding persecution to some extent within Japan and within China. In the Himalayan or Himalayan region, Vajrayana Buddhism is the majority of Buddhists. And I think we've talked about this before, how Vajrayana Buddhism, the word Vajra meaning thunderbolt and Yana meaning vehicle, Vajrayana Buddhism, also known as Tantric Buddhism, emphasizes the heavenly realms or the Buddha realms and how human beings can reach nirvana by identifying themselves in that heavenly realm with the various bodhisattvas and Buddhas. And this takes place in Thailand through intricate worship, intricate ceremonies, and as you saw with the creation of the San Mandala, very intricate forms of meditation. Okay, are there any questions at this point?
The Vajrayana, does that include Nepal as well?
To some extent, yes. Mostly Tibet, though. Mostly Tibet. Although I wouldn't be surprised if some Vajrayana Buddhists in Nepal. And of course, when the Dalai Lama is exiled from Tibet, Vajrayana Buddhism is found wherever the Dalai Lama finds himself. Thus, there are Vajrayana Buddhists in South Asia, there are Vajrayana Buddhists in America as well, and in other countries of the West. Okay, any other questions or comments? Let's see. We don't have any in the chat room. All right. So now we're moving on in the book to a section dealing with Buddhism and modernity. And one of the things it mentions is that in traditional Asian countries, the interrelationship between monastic Buddhists and householder Buddhists and rulers continue. There is one forgets words when one gets old, okay? There is a very strong and mutually encouraging relationship between these three groups. The monastics pray for the householders give food to the monastics and receive from them merit, and rulers also sponsor Buddhism and allow the monasteries to grow, not only in numbers of people, but also in area, also in larger monastery buildings. In 1871, there is a fifth Buddhist council, and this Buddhist council takes it upon itself to formalize and to some extent standardize a number of different Buddhist texts that have arisen over the centuries. And their work has been called the Pali Canon. Pali Canon because the works of Buddhist doctrine and teaching, their editing, are written in the Pali language, which is an offshoot of ancient Sanskrit. And the canon, of course, means the list of books that they consider authoritative. Okay, in terms of monastics and meditation, the book does talk about a number of different kinds of meditation, and many of them can fit under the umbrella of what is called vipassana or mindfulness meditation. And I think we mentioned that in mindfulness meditation, one of the most important points of it is to be absolutely present in the present moment, not dealing with the past, not looking forward to the future, but actually experiencing simply what is. And this also is important in terms of what Vipassana meditation wants you to fully realize. And that is the three doctrines of Buddhism: the doctrine of suffering, the doctrine of impermanence, and the doctrine of no self. We've talked about this a little bit before as well. Suffering, the first noble truth. All life entails suffering. Impermanence, the notion that is premier in Buddhism that nothing lasts forever simply as it is. Everything changes. Everything dissolves. Everything moves and evolves as well. And that also, I think we mentioned, was one of the reasons why the sand mandalas at the end of the ceremonies is destroyed and the sand from it is poured into a river to emphasize the impermanence of all things. And the third notion of the non-self we've also talked about, how in contrast to the Hindu notion of the absolutely eternal Atman self, Buddhists embrace the doctrine that that kind of that kind of a permanent, unchanging essence within each human being is an illusion. Instead, they embrace the notion that there is no such thing as an unchanging permanence within the self. And I think we mentioned one of the ways to think about this is that you are not the same person you were when you woke up this morning or this afternoon if you're on the night shift. You are not the same person that you were. Some of your skin cells have sloughed off. You may have eaten something and are digesting that food. You may have had thoughts and have looked more closely at the chapter in Esposito or in Lopez. Your intelligence has changed. Everything changes. Nothing is permanent. Okay, so in terms of Vipassana meditation, one of the most important ways to do it has to do with simply breathing and being very attentive to your breath in order to empty your mind of all the racket that goes on there. What am I going to cook for dinner? How am I going to get home tonight? Will I be able to write the letter I wanted to, or email or text the person I wanted to see? All of that chatter is what the mindfulness meditation of concentrating on the breath is meant to overcome until you are able to find an empty space within your mind and within yourself. Mahayana Buddhism takes that notion of breath, that notion of mindfulness, and moves it in a little bit different way. One of the points of Mahayana Buddhism that we mentioned is that for Mahayana Buddhism, everything has Buddha nature. Everything is capable of reaching nirvana. Everything is linked to the Buddha and the nature of the Buddha. Thus, in Mahayana Buddhism, one does have to be mindful when you're doing this meditation, and one does, to some extent, notice and feel breath. But for Mahayanists, this mindfulness meditation does not have to happen only when you're sitting still in the lotus position. Mindfulness meditation can happen when you're doing anything. Some of you may have heard of what is called the tea ceremony in Japan. And that ceremony is a ceremony of meditation, and it's structured as drinking tea with another person. And there's very specific things that are done in the tea ceremony. You sit in a certain way. You listen and are present to the sound of the hot water being poured over the tea powder. and then the stirring of that powder into tea. And again, this emphasizes that in Mahayana use of the Vipassana meditation, anything that you do can become part of that meditation. You can meditate while walking by feeling the pressure of the ground on your foot as you move your weight from one to the other. You can practice meditation while you are doing anything. The point again is to be present in the present moment, to notice your breath and also what is going on in the rest of your body, and to find an empty space in which you can further understand those markings of suffering and impermanence and no self. Okay, so in Mahayana Buddhists, that's part of what mindfulness meditation is all about. Pure Land Buddhists do again use meditation and do again concentrate on the breath, but for Pure Land Buddhists, as we've mentioned before, Pure Land Buddhists believe that by having faith in Amida Buddha and by reciting a very short chant, I rely on Amida Buddha, one is brought by Amida Buddha at your death to the Pure Land, a paradise from which the journey to nirvana is simple and easy and short. So Pure Land Buddhists, in their Vipassana meditation, will meditate also on the Pure Land itself, on the paradise that awaits them through simply the grace of Amida Buddha. Vajrayana Buddhists also deal with Vipassana mindfulness meditation. And for them, that meditation concentrates on the traditional depictions of the Bodhisattvas or of the Buddhas, and in certain ways to imagine that and identify themselves with figures in the heavenly realms. Now, at this point, I wanted to mention and also to talk a little bit about, I'm not sure if we discussed the difference between a Buddha and a Bodhisattva. I'll remind you of that if we have done that. A Buddha can be understood as a being who has reached enlightenment totally, and to that extent has in some ways passed out of the realm of this earth, but also is present in this earth, but we'll talk about that a little later. And thus the Buddha in some ways can be seen as not connected to what happens in this realm, Siddhartha Gautama being one of the exceptions. A bodhisattva, however, is a being who is just about to reach nirvana, but instead vows to aid and help others who have not reached that level. So a bodhisattva is a savior figure. A bodhisattva is one you can pray to give you the grace and the enlightenment to come toward nirvana. Amida Buddha, to some extent, acts in that way as a bodhisattva. Gautama Buddha also, to some extent, acts in that way, since the teaching of Gautama remains on this plane. So that's the difference between a Buddha and a bodhisattva, and I wanted to restate that if we had already talked about it, just to make sure that you had that awareness. Okay, are there any questions at this point? Okay. The book also mentions the notions of punya and dana. Punya can be translated as merit, and one builds up merits, and those merits affect your karma so that at the next life you are reborn into a station better equipped to approach nirvana. And dana is the notion that you gain merit, you gain punya by giving selfless giving, giving in which you have yourself no interest. And punya, or merit, is what the householders get when they contribute and give food to the monastics. Also, in some societies and in some groups within Buddhism, the notion of merit can become very, very specific. If you look on page, let me make 184 of the book, there is, in the gray box, selections from the Chinese Buddhist merit account sheet. So you can have a list of those actions that will give you merits and those that will cut down on the merits you have. So, for example, you gain 100 merits if you save one person's life, or you save a woman's chastity, prevent her from being raped, for example, prevent a child from drowning, or continue a family lineage, usually by having children yourself. It goes all the way down to 3 merits. 3 merits you are given when you endure ill treatment without complaint, or when you take it upon yourself to bury an animal who has died, or to urge those making a living by killing to stop. So there's an entire hierarchy of merits you can get. And to some extent also there are an entire hierarchy of demerits that will cut into your cut into your accumulation of merit. And you can get 100 demerits by causing a death, or by rape, or by ending a family lineage. So thus the 100 merits have their corresponding 100 demerits. So I wanted to point that out in terms of the specificness of how this notion of merit has evolved within Buddhism. Okay, also the book talks a little bit about the rituals and the festivals of Buddhism. And here I do have a couple of more videos that I'd like you to look at on the page in Canvas. One of them talks about a festival dealing with the birthday of the Buddha and how that has become extremely important in Buddhism. And the second is what is called the Thousand Hand Dance. And as you'll see, this dance involves very stylized motions, and it is meant to emulate the bodhisattvas. And many of the bodhisattvas, especially in Japan, are carved into statues with hundreds of hands. And these hands are meant to symbolize the reaching out of the bodhisattva to help others. And bodhisattvas, of course, can be either male or female. Those videos together should take about 20 minutes. So I'll pause the recording here, and I'd like you to come back to class, or rather, you can stay in the Zoom room, but we'll start talking again and lecturing again at about 5 minutes before 5. Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording at this point. Okay. Let's see, where am I? Right. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so we're back to rituals and festivals, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at those 2 videos. A couple of other things to say here. In modern times, from about 1800 on, colonialism, of course, as we've seen, has had a very strong and usually negative impact on religions of Asia, and Buddhism is no different. Colonists had defunded Buddhist monasteries. We mentioned before how the interrelationship between rulers and the monasteries was very important in terms of the financial capabilities of the monasteries. And when the colonists come in, who are basically all Christians, they, surprise, surprise, stop funding the Buddhist monasteries and instead pour their support into Christian missionary activity, which, as you can imagine, is rather devastating to Buddhism in the areas. Buddhists, however, do respond to that with reforming some of their practices, and also with emphasizing scholarship in Buddhist texts, and to some extent spreading Buddhist texts to a wider audience. part of this happens with the aid of Western scholars who translate and publish English translations of texts, which were before known only to the elite. Now, most of these texts, as we mentioned, the Pali Canon, were written in Pali, which is a language derivated from ancient Sanskrit. And since they were only in the Pali version, you had to know Pali to read them. And many people either did not know how to read Pali or were not well versed in the meaning of that language. So even among Asians themselves, they did not know some of these Buddhist texts until they were translated into English. And they had learned English from, of course, the colonists. Okay, we'll move on a little bit more to talk about postmodern trends. And one of the things the book mentions is Protestant Buddhism. Okay, be clear, these are Buddhists, not Christians. But as the book mentions, what happens is that certain persons and certain movements within Buddhism decide to take on some of the attitudes and some of the techniques of Protestantism, partly having to do, for example, with a distrust of ritual and also with an embrace of modern science. The book mentions a man by the name of Henry Steele Olcott, who lives from 1832 to 1907. And he was an American who converted to Buddhism and supported reform within Buddhism. Now, Olcott is also a member of the Theosophist movement. And we'll talk about that in the last chapter of the book. But the Theosophists was a movement within Western understanding, a movement founded by, I think her first name is Maria Blavatsky. And she forms this group that embraces both Eastern meditation and Eastern theology with some theologies, with some ideas that come from Western religions. And Olcott was a member also of the Theosophist movement. As we mentioned, Protestant Buddhism de-emphasizes rituals such as are current even today in Vajrayana Buddhism, and emphasized instead meditation. And one of the things that was attractive about doing this is that meditation does not emphasize so much an other world as it emphasizes your behavior and your technique of knowledge within this world, and thus it is considered compatible with science. This fits also with one of the chapters we looked at early on in the class, the chapter that had to do with Shinshu, which of course is a Buddhist group, a Buddhist school of thought. And Shinshu also rejects much ritual and instead emphasizes the simple declaration of faith in Amida Buddha. And when Shinshu encountered Western colonists, some of the Western colonists liked and valued Shinshu because it did not participate in some of what they thought were superstitious rituals. The priesthood of Buddhism in Protestant Buddhism was critiqued as both corrupt and superstitious. And this echoes Protestantism, Christian Protestantism in its beginnings, when, of course, you had Martin Luther protesting against the corruption within the Roman Catholic papacy of the time in the 1500s. Tolerant of other faiths and committed to social reform. These are two aspects also within Protestant Buddhism that fit with both modernism and postmodernism. One person important in Protestant Buddhism is Angarika Dharmapala, who lives from 1864 to 1933. And he addressed the Parliament of World Religions, which took place in the late 1800s. We mentioned this, I think, before in the chapter on Hinduism. The Parliament of World Religions, the first one, took place in Chicago, and it brought together scholars and theologians from all different faiths. And for many in America, this was their first introduction to Asian religions. Angarika Dharmapala was the Buddhist representative, and thus he extended Protestant Buddhism into the knowledge of the Americans and also extended that way of thinking throughout Asia. The book also, another figure who's important in Protestant Buddhism is Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, who lives from 1891 to 1956. He learned about Buddhism, ironically enough, from his studies in the West, and founded a Buddhist revival movement in the Indian state of Maharashtra. And one of the features of Buddhism that was attractive in South Asia had to do with the rejection of caste discrimination. And this leads to mass conversion of people within the lower castes to Ambedkar's movement. Okay, so we're just about out of time. So next time, Thursday, we'll start by going directly into talking about the religions of East Asia, particularly the traditions that originate in China, such as Taoism and Confucianism. Okay, as mentioned before, I will remain in the Zoom room and be readily available there for your questions or comments. Thank you.